Okay, well, it starts with actually the first photograph in the chapter on page 27 is a fishing boat. They don't. This publisher did not supply those initial photographs the way that Pearson does, but it's a fishing boat that is what you might call a trawler. It has those big masts that then move when they're fishing. The masts go from upright to out, and then they drag behind them a trawl net. And so a lot of shrimp boats are this kind of boat. And in this case, I intuitively suspect we're looking at a shrimp boat on page 27 because of the next image, which is actually what you're seeing here is the dissolved oxygen in parts per million. So why is this happening in the Gulf of Mexico at the place where the Mississippi River, huge river, drains into the Gulf of Mexico? And the image shows you a direction of the currents. So they're moving in from east to west. And it shows you this big area painted red, orange, and yellow. So what are the colors? This would be if you wanted to measure oxygen in water, and it's important that there be oxygen in water because things live in the aquatic environment and they need to breathe oxygen. So you can see that a lot of the oxygen is gone. A term that's sometimes used for this is hypoxia, though I've seen another term used for it. Hypoxia refers to does the water have enough oxygen in it? So here there's not enough dissolved oxygen, meaning that you could also call this big zone here a dead zone. And there are dead zones all over the world where what happens? What happens is that upstream, the Mississippi is essentially the breadbasket of America, right? All of the Midwestern states that actually move their commodities by river. So if you were from the Midwest or from the Southeast or anywhere near the Mississippi River or its tributaries. So the Mississippi River is not just that river alone. It has major rivers that pour into it or that are tributaries to it. And that would include the Missouri, which is a very long river, and it starts way up there in the Canadian border. It starts in Yellowstone. So the drainage basin or the watershed, those words are used interchangeably, but they mean the same thing, is the area in which all the streams and creeks and rivulets and drain into the greater Mississippi River. So what that means is that when you're applying fertilizers to agriculture, and remember that this is the agricultural zone par excellence of the United States, a lot of it today is actually corn and soybeans. But that said, you still use basically NPK fertilizers. NPK, well, N is nitrogen, P is phosphorus, and K is potassium. So those are the letters in the periodic table that correspond to those three elements, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are used to make artificial fertilizers. Incidentally, the synthetic or artificial fertilizer industry is part of the petrochemical industry. So yes, we actually use fossil fuels to fertilize the soil to grow crops. So the linkage or the dependence that modern agriculture has on the fossil fuel economy is actually a lot greater than we think. It's not just the pesticides and all the other petrochemicals that are used, including the farm machinery and the fuel it runs on, but also things that you might not realize are fossil fuel based, such as fertilizers. So it's the nitrogen fertilizer that ends up in the water. We saw that yesterday when we saw a picture of a woman taking samples from water that looked like it had algae in it. So what happens when you add nitrogen to water is that it really rewards plants because plants love nitrogen. So those plants in the sea are algae. So the algae will bloom. You'll get what's called an algal bloom, meaning there's way too much algae in the water. Sometimes an algal bloom can be so big and so pronounced that it turns the water red. And that's when you hear the expression a red tide. A red tide, and a lot of it happens, in those areas back east, but even in Florida, they get red tides now and then. And it is a result of polluted seawater, polluted by nitrogen fertilizers. So the nitrogen then rewards the algae bloom, and they die, and they sink to the bottom, where all kinds of creatures, which we'll see in this chapter, what are called detritivores and decomposers, that are oxygen using, they feed on all of this material that has sunk to the bottom. And in the process, their population grows enormously, and they use up all the oxygen. So the first insult in the chain was nitrogen fertilizer in the water. Second, rewarding photosynthesis, which creates an algal bloom. Third, the algal bloom, the algae then sink to the bottom and are devoured by detritivores and decomposers who use up the oxygen, creating a hypoxic zone, which is what you see in this image. So it's interesting and important that we see what Rachel Carson did for environmentalism. She mobilized scientific research and scientific findings at answering questions that had to do with problems that are created by modern society. So she was not as interested in where can we create a new national park. She was interested in how are we creating a toxic society that's affecting all organisms. In her case, she was particularly focused on birds. So let's see if Apple lets me move to the next slide. Okay, so that is one of these cycles. In this case, what you're seeing, if well, let me turn the page, is a system that can be described in this case, very simple terms. So what you have in this case are, you have the photosynthesis, which is the only organism, the only process in the Earth's biosphere that produces oxygen as a waste product, and it consumes carbon dioxide. So photosynthesis is the bottom of the food chain, or you could say it's primary production. It's the very first thing in life needed for the rest of the food chain to be possible at all. So above photosynthesis, above plants, you have the first order consumer that's an herbivore. So the first order consumer is always eating the plants. In this case, it's a little bunny rabbit is feeding on the plants. Then you have the second order consumer, which is the first order carnivore. In this case, the fox gets the bunny rabbit and eats the bunny rabbit. And then eventually the fox dies and its body decomposes, and those little creatures, the detritivores and decomposers, go to work, and they return a lot of that organic material, a lot of that tissue back into soil. And that, in a sense, enriches the soil. And in the process of enriching the soil, it makes it possible for more plants to grow. So that's why this is presented to you here as a cycle from photosynthesis to decomposition, because it's in the process of decompositions that soils get built up by all the organisms that make soil possible, including earthworms and all kinds of even microscopic bacteria and so on are responsible for the fact that soil is a living thing. It's not dirt, it's not rocks, it's much more than that. So there is a very simple way to look at a system that feeds. Let's see, they might even give us, I don't know if they can share this table. No, they're not. Oof. They'll put it at the end of the chapter. Publishers need a spanking. Okay, so what you see here is positive feedback. Positive feedbacks amplify a process such as reproduction and population growth in rabbits. When rabbits feed abundantly, they can produce many young, which feed more and produce more young. Negative feedbacks dampen a process. As rabbits become abundant, predation increases, preventing some from reproducing. Removing foxes from the system could lead to a runaway positive feedback loop with accelerants which accelerates until the ecosystem is destabilized as vegetation is depleted and as the landscape erodes. So this is a sort of classic sample of predator-prey relationships. Actually, when we look at population studies, we'll see that unless the predator is removed, the relationship between predator and prey, when it reaches carrying capacity, is very, very unstable, meaning that you get a large increase in the number of predators when there's lots to eat, and then they die off when they've eaten everything. And then the prey is now able to reproduce better because there's fewer predators and their population increases. And then the predators that remain now have more to eat. So there's a sort of a little sawtooth population contraction, expansion, and it trades off between predator, prey, predator, prey. I'm not sure that the example that they've come up with here for positive or negative feedback is the best one. In fact, because it involves predator-prey relationships, and in this case involves, you have to imagine the removal of the predator, which then, you know, you get what's called rabbit theory, right? When I was teaching population at UC Berkeley, those of us who were very anti-Malthusian, meaning that we really questioned if there was any science behind Malthus's predictions at all, called them rabbit theorists, because they would always talk about unrestrained reproduction. In other words, they would ignore the fact that reproduction, particularly in humans, is always restrained. It never approaches fecundity, but I'm getting way ahead of myself here. Cafecito. So you can imagine a positive feedback loop. The one I think that we're witnessing today is happening on the very extremes of the poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, or the Arctic and the Antarctic, because that is where the impacts of climate are seen in the melting of ice. And when ice melts, it doesn't reflect as much sunlight. So that the positive feedback is the warmer it gets, the more the ice melts. The more the ice melts, the less light is reflected. The less light is reflected, the more is absorbed. The more that's absorbed, the warmer it gets. The warmer it gets, the more ice melts. You get why it's called positive feedback, because the process that we're seeing, that's undergoing, is in fact accelerating and adding to if you want to call it the crisis, the problem of ice melting. So that is a process that feeds on itself. Another example, a lot closer to home, I guess in my case, would be that having allergies to pollen. So most people actually do react to pollen. When there's a lot of it in the air, most people will get a little bit of a runny nose or itchy eyes, and they get through their day. But allergic people, they get into a positive feedback loop where the pollen grains in their sinuses irritate the sinuses. The body then responds by producing hist. And the hist secretes mucus in the sinuses, in the itching and tearing of the eyes. And then the more that the tissue expands, the more pollen comes into contact with it, the more it reacts, you get even more, extreme congestion, violent sneezes, the whole ball of wax that you get when somebody's very allergic to pollen. Or for that matter, it could be being allergic to dust. So respiratory allergies, particularly if they're in the sinuses, are a classic example of a positive feedback loop, because it builds on itself. The way to interrupt it, if you're an allergic person, is you take an antihistamine. So a lot of those are over the counter, and they actually block this process of your body producing hist in order to fight off this insult, as a doctor would call it. So that's positive feedback. Negative feedback is where the system is in some ways correcting. So that's what they're showing you here is both positive and negative feedback, because the negative feedback would be, well, let me think of an example that comes to mind of hot and cold. And we don't experience this in LA because we have such mild winters. But let's say we're in New York, right? It's January. It's freezing out. You're in Manhattan, but it's freezing out. And let's say it's really cold, which is not true right now, but let's hit it. So let's say it's about, 0 or, 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, really cold. So you're out there walking the street. You've got all of your winter gear, your scarf, your woolies, your gloves, and you're still freezing. Got big, thick socks, winter boots. You're walking in the ice. You're freezing your ass off. And you walk into a department store like Macy's, right? And they've got the heat. Hold on. So the minute you get through that little revolving door and you're inside the store, boom, your body says, holy shit, it's hot in here. And you start removing all of the excess bundling that you put on to protect yourself from the cold, because now your brain is telling you it's so warm, you're going to start sweating. So that That is negative feedback, where the new stimulus causes a reverse, or in a sense, a reverse response in terms of your physiology. So they are interesting concepts because we'll see that in understanding processes, and that a lot of understanding environmental science is to understand cycles and processes. So the cycles we'll see because they are, in many cases, biogeochemical. Three prefixes for that word: biological, geological, and chemical. So biogeochemical are uh, um, cycles that cycle things like phosphorus, the hydrologic cycle, the carbon cycle, the oxygen cycle. Those we understand cyclically. Processes, we also understand. What is important about environmental science is that nothing you're looking at is actually standing still. Everything is in motion. And that's what makes earth sciences so interesting compared to, for example, if you were just doing chemistry, in a chemistry lab with your test tubes and your bottle brushes. There you're looking at a lot of processes that are limited. You're looking at a reaction. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But when you look at earth sciences and ecology and biological sciences, you're looking at processes that are, well, depending on your time frame, can be very, very long. Like, for example, what if you're looking at evolution? You're looking at millions and millions of years of process. This is a mangrove swamp, or a mangrove. Actually, to call it a swamp is probably not exactly technically true. These are really dominant, complex coastal ecosystems in the tropics. So when you reach the temperate zones and even the subtropical zones, it's harder to find mangroves. They are fascinating because what you see here, those sticks that you see, are actually not roots. Those sticks are holding up the vegetation. And these mangroves can be incredibly dense and very, very large. So it's a wonderful place for aquatic life to seek refuge. A lot of animals, including sharks, carry out part of their life cycle in mangroves. Now, sharks also use kelp, which is what we have in our coastal zone. We have the kelp forests of the Pacific Ocean. And they start all the way down near San Quintin in Baja, all the way up to the Oregon coast. So the entire Pacific coast of California, Oregon, and the northern part of Baja is actually a kelp forest. And it's a wonderful refuge for all manner of sea life. It's where sharks actually pin the little purses with their little baby sharks. They pin them on the either mangroves or on the kelp, and that's where the baby sharks begin their life cycle. Shrimp, very important, very valuable fishery throughout the world, have part of their life cycle in mangroves. So they need the mangroves. Now, unfortunately, mangroves are getting cleared, removed, destroyed all over the tropics today for all the wrong reasons. The main two culprits for mangrove destruction today in countries like Mexico, but think, Thailand, maybe even Costa Rica today, I'm not sure, is aquaculture, the culturing of shrimp particularly. So they want to create shrimp farms because when you farm shrimp, you concentrate the process. You're not out there in a boat with the trawl nets, waiting to see what the net catches. Here you have a pond that's full of shrimp. All you need to do is wait for them to reach a certain size, and you basically haul the shrimp out of the pond and process them and if you have 10 ponds, you're very busy all year round producing shrimp. So it's a very high value kind of commercial operation, and the best location for culture operations is low-lying areas in tropical and subtropical waters, which is where the mangroves are. Mangroves also protect the coast from hurricanes. So the full force of a hurricane will reach a mangrove, and a lot of the wave action, a lot of the energy, a lot of even the flooding of that hurricane will be hampered by the mangroves. So when you remove the mangroves, then the full force of the hurricane hits, terra firma, hits the land, and, wipes out whatever you've got there, villages, fishing boats, whatever. So mangroves have not just a function in terms of ecology and in terms of aquatic life and life cycles in the ocean, they also have a physical contribution, if you will, to protect land from the full force of tropical storms. Incidentally, footnote, the little itty bitty country of Belize which is actually directly east of Guatemala, directly south of Yucatan. And it's an English-speaking country in Central America. So we often don't think of Belize because we think Central America, we think of the larger Spanish-speaking countries. But it's there, and they have an interesting economy. They do depend a lot on ecotourism, which we'll talk about when we get to that, whether ecotourism is a good or bad thing. But the good thing about ecotourism is that its impact is usually really small. In other words, you don't see a big marina and a giant hotel with all the buses taking the tourists on a tour. That doesn't happen with ecotourism. Ecotourists are typically, well, what in Lima, Peru, we call mochileros, backpackers. So they travel with their backpacks and they stay in youth hostels. They ride trains. They don't take organized tours. They have a very small impact in terms of, the typical tourist impact is not small, but ecotourists do tend to have a smaller impact. So in that sense, it's a gentler form of tourism. And in Belize, they really like the idea that they don't want to develop their coast the way that Mexico did to Cancun. So Belize looked at Cancun and said, "Do we want a Cancun?" And no. So they didn't rip out their mangroves. When Cancun was built, they ripped out all the mangroves to build basically a big resort city that I've never been to. I hope I never do. So mangroves play a very important role, and that's why sometimes we look at particularly sensitive aspects of ecology or of earth systems as being more significant in terms of how much of the biosphere they harbor, they protect, they provide, and mangroves are one of those. Okay, we take a little leap, of course. By the way, on page 31, and I'm sorry that these are left at the end of the chapter. Functions of some common elements. Fertilizers. For fertilizers, you have what I mentioned, NPK. You'll often see this if you study any agricultural system or modern agricultural system like we have in California. You'll run into this, what's called NPK fertilizers, essential components of protein, cells, other biological compounds, crucial as fertilizers for plants. Organic compounds. Now, this one's important because all organic compounds have to have these three elements: carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So for the basic structures of cells and other components of living things in combination with many other elements. So one that's often added to CHO, which would be carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, is nitrogen. So when I learned this in my school in Mexico, we called it chun. Chun was carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Metals. Okay, metals important. You have iron, which has the symbol in the periodic table of Fe. So when you see the word ferrous, that something is ferrous, like, for example, you'll see in geology, they'll say, "Oh, this is a ferrous rock." That's Ferrous, a ferrous rock, not ferrous as in Ferris wheel, but as in having iron. So Fe is iron. Al is aluminum, and Au is gold. So generally malleable, most, not all, react readily with other elements. So iron, for example, oxidizes really easily, which is why so many iron things look rusty. Rust is basically the oxidization of iron. So Fe with a little O thrown in, and you've got rust. Aluminum, very light, very highly recyclable. It amazes me that we don't have 100% recycling with aluminum, because once you process bauxite, which is the geological precursor to aluminum, you have to extract from bauxite an intermediate product called alumina. And bauxite, the whole process of smelting bauxite to get alumina is really energy intensive and really environmentally destructive. But once you process alumina into aluminum, that aluminum is so pure that you can use it again and again and again and again and again and again. We could in theory recycle our aluminum cans forever. We don't, but we can. So that one stands out to me. And then of course gold. What they mean malleable is that it's soft. You can, so often people would test if they get paid in a gold coin. You've seen that in old movies, right? Person gets paid with a gold coin, they put it in their mouth and bite it. They look and make sure that their teeth marks appear on then it's gold. Okay, the next one is toxic elements. Okay, toxic because they are not good when they enter your body, and particularly in large amounts. They list three here. PB is lead. That's because it comes from Latin, and the word in Latin for lead is plumbum. And that's where we get the word plumber. So plumbers traditionally worked with lead pipes. And so that word plumber comes from the Latin word plumbum and the element Pb, which is lead. Hg is mercury. And As is arsenic. Many are metals that can interfere with processes in the nervous system. So these are, in fact, metals, but we refer to them maybe as heavy metals, particularly lead and mercury. So lead, mercury, and arsenic are toxic metals. Iron, aluminum, gold are soft metals. Organic compounds are CHO, and throw in the N if you want to, chon, and fertilizers are NPK. So those are common elements that actually play pretty large role in most of the systems that we're going to look at. Here we're looking at the representation of an atom. So it would be one, I say representation of because, well, there actually is a photograph recently of a molecule. I don't know how they did it, because if you're using a camera, I guess there got to be photons involved. It wasn't even a digital photograph. It was like a photograph. And it was of a carbon chain of like 3 or 4 carbon hexagons all together, and picture. So we're talking about really small scale. That's why these are so hard to see. But human beings figured out, scientists figured out that there were nonetheless elements, and that elements reacted with other elements to form molecules of compounds. So an atom is the most reducible when it comes to putting it on the periodic table of elements. But inside an atom, you have the subatomic particles. The nucleus is made up of protons and neutrons. In this case, and let me see if they're, give us a little help here. This particular atom is carbon 12. So let's see what the Cripps is about this. This model represents a carbon 12 atom containing 6 protons and 6 neutrons in its nucleus, as well as 6 electrons orbiting its outer shells. Many physicists say electrons should be shown as a fuzzy cloud of wave energy rather than an individual particle. Yes, so that we are in a way stuck with what is known as the Niels Bohr atom. So Niels Bohr was one of those physicists of the turn of the century, and late 19th century, that modeled the atom for people to understand it. And what he used was particles for electrons. It looked a lot like planets orbiting the sun. So it was kind of easy for people then to learn from what we knew about our solar system and apply it to atoms and say, okay, so these electrons are orbiting the sun. But that is just one particular representation. And as the book says, it's not actually the most correct one, because electrons move so quickly that it's better to represent them as clouds of energy rather than particles in motion. However, when you look at the relationship between atoms, for example, hydrogen and oxygen. So hydrogen and oxygen come together to form H2O, which is water. So the compound, the molecule of water, is hydrogen and oxygen, and there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So that's why the H has a little 2, H2O. So that means that somewhere in there, they're sharing an electron. That's why understanding an electron as a particle is useful, because how do you then explain how electrons are shared or how electrons travel in electricity? At the same time, that a correct way of understanding them mathematically is as clouds, because what you're talking about is the probability of finding an electron, and enter in Heisenberg and the Heisenberg principles. So atomic physics is fascinating because it grew so quickly from the 19th century and through the 20th century. Just an amazing burst of scientific knowledge that happened in physics as a result of understanding quantum physics, understanding, of course, the structure of atoms. In this case, the protons have a positive charge. The neutrons, like their name suggests, are neutral. They have no charge at all. And the electrons have a negative charge. So there is a balance. If you see the 6 protons are P plus and 6 electrons are E minus, and there's 6 and 6, then you basically have a balanced structure in this particular atom of carbon 12. Obviously, you can make changes. For example, it might need an electron. It might shed an electron, in which case there isn't a balance between the number of protons in the nucleus and the number of electrons that are orbiting in their respective clouds. And that is the difference between isotopes and ions, is that it's in nature, interestingly, a lot of elements are actually found really as compounds. For example, take nitrogen, which is the most prevalent gas in the atmosphere. In the atmosphere, nitrogen is actually N2. That is, it as a gas in the atmosphere, every molecule of it is 2 atoms of nitrogen. Similarly, hydrogen is H2, and oxygen is O2. So it is rare to find in nature that an element is present as a single atom. It usually is bonded in some way to either the same element to produce these molecules or a different element to produce a compound like water, H2O. So here's the representation that you'll probably see in a physics class, where they're using the clouds instead of the little orbiting electrons. These are common molecules with the atoms held together by covalent bonds. So that is a term that's used in understanding physics and chemistry. A covalent bond is a particularly strong bond and are important components of the atmosphere or are important pollutants. So we are looking here at 9 of them. Let's see, hydrogen, that is, even though it's not super prevalent in the atmosphere, it plays a huge role in all of our organic processes. So hydrogen is typically bonded with other elements to, well, take, for example, hydrogen and carbon together create hydrocarbons. And hydrocarbons are everything from, consider carbohydrates, right? Which is, starchy food. We love our pasta, we love our pizza. That's big on carbs, which people shorten the term to carbs. They mean carbohydrates, and that means a lot of carbon and a lot of hydrogen. Similarly, hydrocarbons include such things as, yes, petroleum and gasoline. And so that is a very important bond is between hydrogen and carbon. Then you can see the oxygen there also presented as O2. At the top, they're all 2s, H2, O2, and 2. And then on the next line, you have hydrochloric acid. So that's big chlorine, little hydrogen attached to it, and that's one of each. Water, H2O. Carbon dioxide, so 1 carbon and 2 oxygens, and that's why we often refer to it as CO2. Sulfur dioxide, so 1 sulfur and 2 oxygens, that's SO2. You can actually get different oxides of sulfur, and when we talk about pollutants in the atmosphere, you'll see that there's SO2 and SO3 and SO. So sometimes atmospheric scientists and the EPA will refer to all of these oxidized versions of sulfur as SOx. They'll put an X instead of the numbers because it can be one atom of each, or sulfur dioxide or sulfur trioxide. The next one is nitrogen dioxide, NO2, and that is also a pollutant that comes out of the tailpipes of cars when we combust carbohydrates or hydrocarbons in the gas tank. And then there is methane, CH4. So you got 1 big carbon in the middle and 4 hydrogens attached to it. It's also what we call natural gas. And methane, CH4, is a very powerful greenhouse gas. Now remember, a greenhouse gas is a gas in the atmosphere that traps infrared light. So one of the main way our atmosphere is warming up is that we have greenhouse gases. The main ones are carbon dioxide is the most prevalent. That accounts for most of the what we count as greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it's going to be CO2, but followed very closely by methane, CH4. CH4 is 80 times more heat trapping than CO2. And then add to that nitrogen dioxide and hexavalent compounds, and you've got your major greenhouse gases. So of the greenhouse gases, 3 of them are right here in this little display of important compounds that you actually do run into a whole lot, either studying biology or even studying the problems of pollution. Now, this is a very useful little chart. Let's see. Actually, on page 33, they do talk about the properties of water. And since it's right in the middle of this chart, it's really worth visiting, because notice that water, actually, this is true of a lot of them, but unlike carbon dioxide, you notice that in carbon dioxide, the carbon's in the middle, and then the oxygens are on either end. It's almost a straight line. But in water, the hydrogens are not in a straight line. They're on one side of the molecule. So that the backs, if you want to call it the backside, the oxygen side, where you can't see the hydrogen, behaves differently than the part of the molecule where you do see the hydrogen. It's an amazing property of water. And it's only because of this angle where the hydrogen atoms attached to the oxygen are actually attached at an angle and not in a straight line. Because what that allows water to do is to be the most universal of all solvents. What does that mean? That more things dissolve in water than anything else. And that's very important for understanding life, because we know that, for example, you have to have oxygen in water to support fish. So H2O has this funny angle. And that means that when you're looking at it head on, in this case, you're looking at the hydrogens, the net charge of this molecule will be positive when you're looking at the hydrogens, because their charge is net positive. But when you flip it around so that you can't see the hydrogens, you can only see the oxygen, the charge is net negative, which allows water to bond with other elements, either through the positive charges or the negative charges. That's what makes it so universal. So in the book, there are 6 points they make about water. Water molecules are polar. That is, they have a slight positive charge on one side and a slight negative charge on the other. Therefore, water readily dissolves polar or ionic substances, including sugars, nutrients, and it carries materials from cells. The next point is that water is the only organic liquid that occurs in nature under normal conditions at temperatures suitable for life. Organisms synthesize organic compounds, such as oils and alcohols, that remain liquid at ambient temperatures and that are therefore extremely valuable to life. But the predominant liquid in nature is water. Third, water molecules are cohesive, tending to stick together. That is one of its fabulous qualities. And it's not a joke to say it. Sometimes you're learning chemistry class, they'll refer to it as the stickiness of water molecules. When you spill water on your countertop in the kitchen, you'll notice that it's not like spilling olive oil. I know from experience. When you spill olive oil, it spreads out on the counter. Very thin, it's oil, right? Water has it's like raised. It's a little bit thick. And that's because of the stickiness of water molecules. They like to stick together. So water behaves interestingly from that feature. And it's also very important to understand then how ice floats. So that is, it's miraculous because normally in physics, the denser a material, the heavier a material, the more likely it is to sink. But not in the case of water, where ice takes up more room than liquid water. It needs more space because the molecules are arranged very nicely like crystals. Like when you put water in your freezer, you want ice cubes later, you look in and now the water has turned to ice. And actually sometimes, depending on if you have an ice maker, forget about it. But if you have old school trays, like I have in my fridge, and you're waiting for the ice, you take the tray out and it hasn't frozen yet. It's somewhere between it's starting to freeze. And you might notice that in the cubes, there are these little strings. That's the early crystallization of the water that begins the process of freezing the whole thing to get you an ice cube. So water has this fantastic property of arranging itself at low temperatures into a lattice. And the interesting thing about that is that water at its densest is actually above zero. Water at its 0 Celsius. Water at its densest is about 2 degrees Celsius. And then as it freezes, it takes up more room and it's less dense. So frozen ice, water at 0 degrees Celsius is less dense than water at 2 degrees Celsius. That is interesting because that's why ice floats. If ice didn't float, if it sank to the bottom of the oceans would just be huge slush balls. But because it floats, we have basically a livable planet. Water has the highest surface tension of any common natural liquid. Water also adheres to surfaces. As a result, water is subject to capillary action. It can be drawn up in small channels. That's what plants do. Without this property, the movement of water and nutrients through living organisms might not be possible. So it's incredible qualities of this very modest molecule that has these fantastic qualities that make life possible, that make the Earth an interesting place, because this is the only place we know where not only do we see water, but we see it in all three of its phases: solid, liquid, and gas. Water is unique in that it expands when it crystallizes. So could we just touch that one? And so that is why at the surface of a lake or a river, the water that freezes in the wintertime forms floating ice. It insulates underlying layers, keeping most water bodies liquid and aquatic organisms alive throughout the winter in most places. Without this feature, many aquatic systems would freeze solid in the winter. That's why you have, well, we don't, people in Michigan go ice fishing. And they have these, I think they call them shanties. They have these little cabins that are on skis that you can slide out on the ice. And then you sit there in your little cabin, warming up, and you make a hole in the ice and you put your fishing line in there and you fish for the fish that are underneath the ice. They're doing actually quite well underneath the ice. So that is one of its incredible qualities. By the way, I don't know if any of you saw the Napoleon movie. It's okay. It's long. And it's, if you like, battle scene, love scene, battle scene, love scene, battle scene, it's Napoleon. But there really, there's a scene in it where he was a smart cookie, Peach and Napoleon. I guess it's the Russian army is going to attack his camp. And Napoleon has done a very clever thing where he set up his camp on the other side of basically the lake, so that the Russians see the camp and they're on their horses and they charge. But the space before the camp is frozen water. It's a lake. And the horses break through the ice and they all fall into the freezing water. Just referencing a movie, it's a bit hyped. The Napoleon movie, people are probably going to forget about it. Water has a high heat of vaporization, using a great deal of heat to convert from liquid to vapor. Consequently, evaporating water is an effective way for organisms to shed excess heat. We call that perspiration, right? Many animals pant or sweat or moisten evaporative cooling surfaces. And that's one of our negative feedback loops, is that when we're too hot, we perspire. The perspiration on our skin is water. As it evaporates, it transfers the heat from the body to our surrounding air, and we cool off. So that is the way in which we don't overheat when it's too hot. Water also has a high specific heat. That is, water absorbs a great deal of heat before it changes temperature. Very important detail, because that's what's happened with the oceans and climate change. The oceans are slow to absorb the heat, but when they do, they're slow to give it up. Water's slow response to temperature change helps moderate global temperatures, keeping the environment warm in winter and cool in summer. And that's because our planet, even though we call it Earth, from space is mostly water. It's 70% of the Earth's surface is the oceans, is water. So it does play a huge role in regulating climate and so on. The next relationship, now we're talking about acids and bases. Substances that readily give up hydrogen in water are known as acids. Hydrochloric acid, for example, dissociates in water from H plus and Cl minus ions. In later chapters, you may read about acid rain. Substances that readily bond with hydrogen, hydrogen plus ions, so the little plus means it's an ion, are called bases or alkaline substances. So sodium hydroxide, NaOH, for example, releases hydroxide ions, OH minus, that bond with H plus ions in water. Bases can be highly reactive, so they cause significant environmental problems. Acids and bases are also essential to living things. The acids in your stomach help you digest food, for example, and acids in soil help make nutrients available to growing plants. So that's why the pH scale is so interesting, because it isn't a scale from like 1 to 28, right? It's a scale where the middle, 7, is actually, in a sense, the baseline or the neutral. So any number bigger than 7, things get more and more acidic. And excuse me, did they do this backwards? Yes. Any number excuse me, any number bigger than 7 is going to be more and more alkaline or more basic. And any number smaller than 7 is going to be more and more acidic. So 7 is neutral, and it is the pH is what we refer to it, which actually means the power of hydrogen. The power of hydrogen is 7 for everything that's neutral. That includes hemoglobin in your blood, and it includes pure water. Then you look at salt water in the ocean, seawater, and it has a pH of about 8. But as we add more carbon dioxide to the oceans, as the oceans acidify, becoming more and more acidic, that number moves from 8 towards 7. So when we talk about acidification of the oceans, we mean that the oceans are becoming less basic, more acidic. Next one, baking soda. That's the one that we often use to neutralize. For example, if we have an upset stomach, we'll take baking soda, and that will neutralize the acids in your stomach. Milk of Magnesia and the Great Salt Lake have a pH of 10. And so it's telling you here what the concentration of hydrogen ions compared to distilled water. And ammonia, now we're getting into stuff you should not inhale. Soapy water at 12, bleaches and oven cleaner at 13, and liquid drain cleaner at 14. So you can see how much more intense it gets as it moves away from 7. Similarly, moving to the more acidic ones, urine, saliva, and milk are slightly acidic. Soft water, coffee, normal rainwater are 5. Tomato juice, now we're getting into the more acidic. Grapefruit, orange, and soda pop are 3. Lemon juice, stomach acids, and vinegar are 2. What? Yes, lemon is very acidic. It's as acidic as your stomach acids, and vinegar, which is why it's actually very useful. You know what you see when you often visit if you eat Mexican food in a Mexican restaurant, you often get a little tray of lemons that are all cut up, you know, limoncito. And the tradition was, at least where I grew up, is you put lemon juice on everything. Mexican penicillin, because it's so acidic that it will actually kill any critters. Well, not any, but most critters in your food, if in fact, if you're worried about that. So it was always a way of preventing, you know, whatever might make you sick by just putting lemon juice on it. What do they say? Chicken soup is Jewish penicillin and lemon juice is Mexican penicillin. Hydrochloric acid, that's very, very acidic. And it's very, very caustic, very corrosive. And then battery acid is the worst. It has a pH of 0. So you don't want, I was taking a car battery into AutoZone because it had a warranty and they would replace it if the dang thing failed. And on the sidewalk, right in front of the AutoZone, the damn battery fell off the dolly and it broke. And all the liquid in the battery came out on the sidewalk. One of the employees from the store came running out and we were going to like clean it up. He said, no, don't touch that shit. And he came out with, I don't know how they cleaned it up. It actually left a real mark on the sidewalk, on the concrete. So yeah, it's pretty acidic stuff. So this is the pH scale. And what's important about it is that all chemical reactions are reactions between acids and bases. And that becomes very important in understanding life and the way that processes in organisms actually take place as reactions between acids and bases. So on page 33, they start discussing that. And then that in about 3 or 4 paragraphs, we describe acids and bases in terms of pH, the negative logarithm of its concentration of hydrogen ions. Acids have a pH below 7, bases have a pH greater than 7. A solution of exactly pH 7 is neutral. Because the pH scale is logarithmic, pH 6 represents 10 times more hydrogen ions in a solution than pH 7. That's why on the left side of here, you see what they mean by logarithmic. Notice the expansion of the numbers, right? And there would be concentrations of hydrogen ions compared to distilled water. And okay, next is, now you're probably wondering, do we really have to know all of this? Well, I haven't checked all the little details of the quiz for this chapter. I'm pretty sure it's going to ask some questions about this, but this isn't the whole point of the course. We're not really in a chemistry class. We're not even in a biochemistry class. So it's here what we really want to do all the time is ask ourselves, what's the takeaway? What are we learning from this? Now, the quiz might be obnoxious and asking you something a little bit more detailed. That's why it's open book, open notes, open collaboration, open internet, the whole thing, so that at least we can get them right. And then, in a sense, not worry about them again. These are the 4 major groups of biologically important organic molecules based on repeating subunits of these carbon-based structures. Basic structures are shown for a butyric acid, which is a building block of lipids. We'll find out later what that is. And hydrocarbon, B, and simple carbohydrate, C, a protein, and D, a nucleotide, a component of nucleic acids. So there's 4 of them here. And what they have in common is the carbon rings, or the role that carbon plays in a sense, creating or supporting, structuring these larger molecules. So now we're not looking at the little molecules like N2 or H2O. These are bigger. For example, at the very top, you have a hydrocarbon. So that's going to be carbon and hydrogen. And the example they give is propane. So all of those hydrocarbons, ethane, methane, propane, gasoline, all of that stuff is collections of carbon and hydrogen. So there's 3 carbons here and 8 hydrogens. If you can organize the carbons into a ring, you can see that for the sugar, for glucose. In this case, glucose not only has hydrogen and carbon, but it also has oxygen. So that's how we can, in a sense, derive energy from sugars. But plants produce sugars. All biological processes at some point produce sugars. That is the way that, in a sense, we transfer energy from tissues to cells. Amino acids. Now, those are critically important to understanding what a DNA is. So remember that DNA means deoxyribonucleic acid. So our structures, our molecular structures for inheritance and for coding our traits and so on, depends entirely on these very complicated double helix of amino acid chains. So in DNA, there is a sequence or chain. We'll see in the next image what that means, that are readable by by enzymes, by hormones, etc. So that's a very important aspect of arranging molecules in such a way that they have, well, consider the nucleotides. So the nucleotides are what makes the DNA sequence possible. So here you're looking at there is adenine, which is an amino acid, which has a nitrogen containing base. So remember, acids and bases, in some ways, these chains have to be neutral. In other words, have to balance acids and bases so that they keep their structures. Adenosine triphosphate, otherwise known as ATP, is critical for the transfer of energy. That is what plants produce ATP and we produce ATP. It's what gives us our oomph. And then attached to it is something called a phosphate group, which is essentially phosphorus and oxygen in this little chain that you can see on the left side of D nucleotides. So nucleotides are important because they actually are a component of nucleic acids. So what we're doing here is we're starting with very simple concept of an atom, from atom to molecule, atom subatomic um, particles or subatomic levels like electrons, protons, and neutrons. Then we've looked at combinations of atoms in molecular form, either as pure element or as compounds like water. And then we've looked at more complicated combinations involving acids and bases. And from that, we're able to get much more complicated molecular structures that include such things as proteins and hormones and all the stuff that happens that makes life possible. But the double helix, which incidentally is interesting, this was a discovery made in the 20th century. So we didn't know what the mechanism, by we, I mean, humans didn't know the mechanism of inheritance until this was discovered. But when you look at the theory of evolution, Charles Darwin proposes that traits are inheritable. That's the cornerstone of his theory of evolution, that a fertile offspring is a feature of successful species evolution, and that that evolution requires passing on traits from the parents' generation to the offspring. So when he was confronted with that, and people said, "Okay, Chucky, great idea, but what's the mechanism? How is it possible that that the offspring inherit the characteristics of their parents?" Darwin's answer was great. He said, "I don't know. In time we'll know." It's the wonderful thing about the scientific method and big ideas in science, because Charles Darwin's theory of evolution has really stood the test of time. It's probably one of the most, I hate to use this trite word, robust theories in science is evolutionary biology. In other words, in science, your mission as a scientist is to find out what's wrong with the dominant theory, what Thomas Kuhn called the dominant paradigm. So the dominant paradigm in biology is Darwinian evolutionary biology, which has been proven to be mostly correct, like 90% of the time. There are some mistakes that Darwin made in some of his assumptions, maybe about the evolutionary process, but none of his mistakes have in any way dislodged its fundamental finding. But he didn't know the mechanism of inheritance. And he had enough, I don't want to say faith, he had enough trust in his discovery that in time, the mechanism of inheritance would be discovered. And it took over 100 years for scientists in the 20th century to say, ta-da, and we discovered it. By the way, just a footnote to this, the two scientists that got the credit for the identification of the double helix as DNA were both men. But the research that went into DNA was carried out by more than the two blokes that got the Nobel Prize. And in fact, there's many women involved one woman in particular involved in the structure, understanding the structure of a DNA double helix. This is not unusual in science. I've run into a lot of these stories where the credit for a discovery went to the male scientist, and the women who either participated in or might have even been pivotal in the discovery are forgotten. Now, fortunately, there are attempts to rectify this in the literature, and even in the claims and awards that are given. Consider the vital role that women played in making it possible for NASA to send human beings to the moon. So a movie about that, right? And add to that they were African-American women that were working for NASA. They were very brilliant mathematicians, and they figured out the trajectory for the rocket to take the astronauts to the moon and bring them back. So often you actually need somebody to go back into the history of science or back into the details of how they came up with the discovery to find that many of the contributors were not, in a sense, properly credited, particularly when they are not men. So there is built-in sexism, if you will, in the way we attribute credit for major discoveries in science. That said, Chucky Darwin was working by himself, almost by himself in the Galapagos Islands when he was looking at all the birds and their beaks, and he came up, they were all finches, and he came up with his theory of evolution. So this is what makes What you see here are the handshakes between the different amino acids. And that's why they have the little dots in between. For example, there is the sugar phosphate backbone, there is the base, there is the nucleotide, and there's the hydrogen bond. So the hydrogen bond is that thing in between them, and that is what makes that particular rung on the double helix a unique, you could say it's a unique sequence, so that we understand DNA as a sequence. And what matters is when cells reproduce, how they divide their DNA so that the new cells carry the same genetic information in the nucleus of the cell. This is an example of plant tissue and single cell's interior. The cellulose will give the cell structure. A lipoprotein membrane maintains the constant interior. The nucleus stores genetic information. A large vacuole stores wastes, and chloroplasts carry out photosynthesis. Mitochondria carry out respiration. So this is giving you the structure of a plant cell. Why that matters is that plant cells, their membranes, their cell exterior is more, I don't know the right word here, stiff than animal cells. That is because plants really do need to control the environment inside their cells even more than we do, because they're out there in the elements. So what they've done is they've zoomed into a leaf, and that's what you're seeing at the top. There's the flower, and then there's the leaf, and then the leaf is showing you what the structure of that leaf is. It has a cuticle that protects the leaf from losing too much water, and it protects it from too much ultraviolet light. And then under that, you have the epidermis. Interestingly, we also have an epidermis, right? Underneath our exterior skin, the next layer is known as our epidermis. And then you have the mesophyll. We don't have that one. And that is what is going on in terms of photosynthesis. And then the mesophyll area in its middle section has these bundle sheaths. And the bundle sheaths are known as vascular bundles, meaning that that's how the leaf receives and sends whatever's going on chemically in these cells in the leaf. It has to produce nutrients and it has to absorb water. So that is why you have these bundles or sheaths that carry vessels that allow water to travel against gravity upwards, which is an amazing thing. And then the plants can actually take up the water and grow. And then at the very bottom, you have something called a stoma. And that's a little sort of vent or underneath. That's why the underside of a leaf often looks different than the upper side. The upper side has that cuticle. It might even be shiny. It might even be, easy to touch. And then you flip the leaf over and it often has a different color. If it's green, it'll be slightly more pale and kind of fuzzy, and it has the stoma. So leaf structures are fascinating that way because so much goes on in this rather thin collection of different kinds of tissues. So then what they do is they zoom in the mesophyll, they zoom into those middle cells, which are the ones that are then represented at the bottom with the cell membrane, the cell wall, the mitochondrion, the chloroplast, the nucleus, the vacuoles, the whole structure of cells. And this is what is so important to understanding life on Earth, is the emergence of cell-based biology. Cells actually took a long time to evolve, and they evolved from something that we call lipids, which are carbohydrates, and they're in that quality of carbohydrates where they don't dissolve easily in water at all. Lipids are typically hydrophobic, meaning that they have one of their sides repels water. That's very important, because if you can have a tissue that on one side accepts water and on the other side repels water, and then you close the tissue around, you've got a cell. You've got something where the conditions and the environment inside that lipid bilayer is different than the outside. And that's critically important to seeing early stages of cell life on the planet comes from lipid bilayers. Energy. Okay, so this chapter does have the kitchen sink. And here you're looking at something very prosaic. You're looking actually at a human-made dam on a river. Incidentally, these things have turned out to be a little bit controversial. we've got way too many dams on way too many creeks and rivers in the United States, hundreds and thousands. And it does disrupt the entire balance of nature. For example, beavers are really good at making dams, but if you build an artificial dam, then the beaver population will probably decline. It changes the course of water, how the water behaves, and it creates these large pools behind it. In this case, the image isn't to show you the problem of dam building on creeks and streams and rivers. It's to show you a model of understanding the difference between potential energy, that's water behind the dam, and kinetic energy, which we often call the energy of motion, which is water then by gravity falling down the waterfall and continuing the course of the river. So that's two different kinds of energy that are important to understand the difference between potential energy and kinetic energy. Some of that kinetic energy will actually be converted to heat because motion and friction create heat. How are we doing? Oh, on here. This is a colony of tube worms and mussel clusters over a cool deep sea methane seep in the Gulf of Mexico. Tube worms are interesting because they are also a recent discovery. I remember going to a film festival in Oakland, California. There was an environmental film festival, and they were showing you new documentary films that had been made by environmentalists. This is a long time ago, and they had just successfully, finally filmed tube worms. These are organisms that are like a worm, and they do have hemoglobin, which is why you see that they're red, but they live inside these very, very brittle tubes. And they feed off the chemistry of hydrothermal vents. So at the bottom of the ocean, not every part of the ocean, but a lot of the ocean, you have this volcanic activity. And that volcanic activity sends material to the ocean floor. And when it reaches the ocean floor, you have a big chemical reaction. For example, a lot of what might be produced in a volcanic vent might be very different than what life and the rest of the planet needs. In fact, it's the opposite. It's rich in acid. Sometimes it's literally sulfuric acid. There's no oxygen. These critters do not depend on oxygen. It is hypothesized, probably very correctly, that life on Earth begins in these volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean. That the life as we know it today, which we're in our third atmosphere on planet Earth. So life as we know it today actually had to modify the atmosphere in order to succeed at living in it. And the big change was plants. So once plants evolved and were in the atmosphere, they changed the atmosphere and created an oxygen-rich atmosphere, which then rewarded all the critters that breathe oxygen. So oxygen-breathing creatures and plants come later than this early form of evolution that happens in volcanic vents. So they're sometimes referred to as chemotrophs. By the way, when you see the word troph, T-R-O-P-H, it basically means eating. So a chemotroph is an organism that actually gets its needs from chemistry directly and not, for example, from breathing. Deep in the Earth's crust, deep on the ocean floor, and in hot springs, such as those in Yellowstone National Park, we can find extremophiles. Extremophiles are organisms that gain their energy from chemosynthesis, or the extraction of energy from inorganic chemical compounds, such as hydrogen sulfide. Until 30 years ago, we knew almost nothing about these organisms and their ecosystems. Recent deep-sea exploration has shown us the abundance of astonishingly varied life occurs hundreds of meters deep in the ocean floor. These ecosystems cluster around thermal vents, cracks where the boiling hot water, heated by magma in the Earth's crust, escapes from the ocean floor. Here, microorganisms grow by oxidizing hydrogen sulfide bacteria. Bacteria support an ecosystem that includes blind shrimp, giant tube worms, hairy crabs, strange clams, and other unusual organisms. So that's what this picture is. These are thriving in an environment that we would find hostile to our particular kinds of tissues. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. What's very interesting about the electromagnetic spectrum is that everything that we associate with energy on some level is found on it. So that it is one of those unifying ideas in physics and in chemistry that allows us to put on the same chart everything from, oh, I don't know, X-raying your teeth to listening to FM radio. So it's interesting. This book has all of the scales reversed. That's why I messed up on the pH scale. And with La Posada, they start with the slower wavelengths on the left and the faster wavelengths on the right. Here they've done the opposite. Okay, no up. So in the middle, well, roughly the middle, you have what we call visible light. So visible light takes place somewhere between 1 micrometer to 0.1 micrometer. Let's see if that is correct. The electromagnetic spectrum, our eyes are sensitive to visible light wavelengths, which make up nearly half the energy that reaches the Earth's surface, represented in the area under the solar radiation curve. Photosynthesizing plants use the most abundant solar wavelengths, light and infrared. The Earth re-emits lower energy, longer wavelengths shown in the terrestrial radiation curve, made mainly in the infrared part of the spectrum. So infrared, then you can see, is on this side, and that's why they're calling it terrestrial radiation. It's a slower wavelength than ultraviolet. Ultraviolet is faster, and it actually begins at 0.4 micrometers and works its way up to 10 nanometers. It is, the interesting thing about ultraviolet is that it has it's depending on its wavelength, depending on its frequency, it's either ionizing or non-ionizing. What the hell does that mean? What it means is that when you look at the visible light spectrum and you go in this direction toward infrared, microwaves, radio waves, yada, you actually have slower wavelengths, and these are gentler frequencies. What I mean by that is that contrary to what a lot of people believe, and they believe this sort of as an urban myth, that microwave ovens are bad for you. I've been hearing, my nephew lived in a house in Mar Vista, you know, a sort of collective house with a lot of young adults sharing the house. No microwave ovens in the house. And I said, Matthew, what's up with that? Oh, no, our roommates, they're against microwave ovens. You know, they have radiation. But yeah, dude, your radio has radiation. Well, it's called a radio. But because science education is miserably lacking in the United States, people know sort of half the story, not the whole story. They know half the story. So all they have to hear is that microwave ovens use electromagnetic radiation to cook your food. That can't be good. Radiation, doesn't that give you cancer? And they're convinced that if you cook food in a microwave oven, you're going to get cancer. Microwave ovens have been around, dare I say, since 1949. They've been around a long time. They've gotten better. It's true that earlier microwave ovens, the doors didn't close quite right and they would, quote, leak radiation. But unless you've been told by your doctor and you might have a pacemaker, you might have something, you shouldn't get near the microwave oven, and a whole lot of other things too. No, the microwave oven can't hurt you. If it could, we would know by now. 1949 is a long time ago. We would have a wake of corpses of people who died from microwave ovens. But there is no wake of corpses because microwave ovens don't kill people. They don't even make people sick. Now, it's true that some people who are chefs, foodies, don't like cooking with microwaves. That's different. Not liking it is different than saying it's dangerous. So that I've had to have this little fight with friends who are brilliant. I mean, one of my friends got a PhD from UCLA, and he's convinced that microwave ovens are bad for you. And I said, Derek, Jesus Christ. So what you see then in the big curve here is the visible light spectrum that, of course, plants depend on. We only see from purple to red. We don't see infrared and we don't see ultraviolet. Now, what we do see sometimes in terms of ultraviolet is you might go to a dance club where they have what people call black light. And that's actually ultraviolet light. That's why if you're wearing like a white shirt, it'll glow, you know, with black light, or the white of your eyes or your teeth will glow. You should never look into a black light. Okay, and I think in clubs they do take some care that people can't stare into these lights. They will affect your retina. They can affect your vision. In other words, they can harm you. And the other thing about ultraviolet light is that while a lot of it is non-ionizing, meaning it's in this safe category, some of it is ionizing. The faster wavelengths of ultraviolet light are ionizing radiation. And that's why too much ultraviolet light can burn your skin. It can not only burn your skin, but it can cause skin cancer because ultraviolet light can penetrate the dermis, that's below the epidermis, and can affect the nuclei of your cells. And in upsetting them, it can cause them to lose their DNA structure so that reading the cell's DNA ends up in an error. And that error is often cell growth, tumors. So ultraviolet light in excess can cause skin cancer and does. And in fact, people who do spend a lot of time snowboarding, in ski resorts, and they're there for, months of the year, they should take extra care to use the best sunblock they can get, particularly on the nose and on the top of your ears. And if you don't wear a wool hat, even in your scalp. But the place, if you're out in the snow, you're going to get even more UV radiation than if you're out on the beach because it's bouncing off the snow. So that's a lot of UV radiation. And it will burn your skin, and it can cause skin cancers. I know people he was a snow surveyor, and he'd spend weeks on end in the Sierra Nevada measuring the depth of the snow, and he got skin cancer on his nose. He even made us, when we go on field trips, wear hats that covered your ears, the back of your neck, and your nose. So do that if you're out in the wilderness areas for long periods of time. Do protect yourself from UV light because more of it is coming through the atmosphere today than in the past. And that has to do with something we'll cover when we talk about the atmosphere. Even faster than ultraviolet is the serious stuff. Now, notice that X-rays have quite a range from 10 nanometers all the way to 0.1 nanometers. That's why X-rays are so useful in medicine, because you can use X-rays to look at fractured bones. You can also use X-rays to find growths or tumors in tissues. You can also use X-rays to treat cancer, as in radiation therapy, where doses of radiation are bombard the cancer cells with that and ideally destroy them. So that's why you see this huge amount of applications for X-rays. I mean, they're used in airports to look at your luggage. They're used at border crossings to see what's inside a truck. They're used by the dentist to see where your cavities are. And that's why we make big use of X-rays. Nonetheless, they are dangerous. And that's why you wear, the lead apron at the dentist, and why the X-ray tech is always behind a wall that has lead in it and big glass, because they work around X-rays all day long. And you do not want to be exposed in any kind of chronic way to X-rays that will affect your health, which is why X-ray people take great care. And even when you get X-rays, they protect different tissues in your body. Like, for example, the dentist was very keen on protecting my neck. So apparently X-rays, getting your neck X-ray can be problematic. Okay, then we're talking about serious shit, gamma rays. If ultraviolet can go through your epidermis and upset the DNA in your dermis and cause skin cancer, and X-rays can go through all the soft tissue. X-rays only stop when they meet the hard stuff, namely bones. That's why they're so useful for looking at where's the broken bone. The X-ray will stop at the bone, show you where the fracture is. But gamma rays go through everything. They go through the bones. So gamma rays will go right through the bone and right into the bone marrow. And bone marrow is where we make red blood. That is the source of our red blood cells. It's made in the marrow of our bones. So when gamma rays penetrate bones and upset that part of the bone that makes red blood, the result is leukemia, which is cancer of the blood. Beyond gamma rays, you have cosmic rays, and those come right out of the sun. They go through the whole planet. There's no way to avoid cosmic rays, even though, interestingly, it has become an issue with the idea that if they were going to send astronauts to Mars, that the trip would be so long that you'd have to protect those astronauts from cosmic rays that are going to penetrate their spacecraft and possibly, affect their tissues. So the short wavelengths, ionizing radiation, useful but difficult, troublesome, you could say. Non-ionizing radiation, the long wavelengths, useful and not harmful. So infrared, that's your remote for your TV uses infrared. Um, the there's all kinds of applications for infrared light that we take for granted, but they're there all the time. They're exaggerating here, but this is the infrared radiation that the Earth re-emits to outer space. And that's where the greenhouse effect happens, because it's this set of wavelengths that are captured by methane, carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and chlorinated fluorocarbons. They react to this wavelength, and they react by absorbing that energy and then rattling like a little rattle, and that's what we call heat. So the heating up of the atmosphere from greenhouse gases is the capturing of this curve of infrared light that planet Earth is re-emitting to space after having absorbed most of the visible light spectrum and, very importantly, including ultraviolet light. Then you get microwaves. These are, if you make a long distance phone call, what's that? Oh dear, I'm dating myself. A long distance phone call. Or back in my day, we had landlines on the telephone, and you could call somebody in New York City if you knew the area code, and then you'd dial the number, and you'd wait, and it would ring and ring and ring, and then they'd pick up on the other end, and hello, can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear you fine. How you doing? Happy birthday. We have cell phones today, and cell phones, the reason why you don't have to change your area code, I have friends that used to live in LA and they've lived in New York for decades. They still have their 310 area code for their phones because it doesn't matter with cell phones. Cell towers work differently, and cell phone, in some cases, even use satellite linkages. Now, there is such a thing as satellite phones, not the same thing as cell towers, but cell phones can complete calls, anywhere in the world using a combination of cell towers and of satellites. So telephones have come a long way. That said, we used to use microwaves as a way to transmit long distance phone calls, and we still use microwaves for a lot of things. So that's why you sometimes see microwave antennas. And then radio waves, and that's everything. That's AM, FM, shortwave, long wave, medium wave, and they're very big waves. This one's 10 centimeters in wavelength. That you can see 10 centimeters. And if you go all the way over here, they're even 1 meter. So these are some slow waves, and they are harmless. So yes, you can eat food that was cooked in a microwave oven. It's not that big a whoop than your FM radio. But don't tell that to my nephew. Okay. Now this is photosynthesis, and it's actually complicated. They've simplified it for our purposes here, and I'm glad they did because it can look really complicated. All we really need to understand about photosynthesis is what goes on in the daytime is different than what goes on at night. So obviously in the daytime, light energy is essential for the process where chlorophyll gets, in a sense, energized. So that's why it shows up here, energized chlorophyll. Notice the blue arrow is circulating this way. That is a light-dependent reaction. And the light that it's using, by the way, is ultraviolet light. And it will then combine with high energy molecules. So here's water and chlorophyll working together. And in the process, then what is absorbed is CO2, and what is emitted is oxygen. So the oxygen is being emitted in the daytime reaction. You can see this blue arrow, the energized chlorophyll making its cycle, is emitting oxygen as a waste product. Thank you, plants. And at night, it's absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to build up its sugars. So these are light-independent reactions, and what comes out of that is carbohydrates, CH2O. So that's what's interesting about plants and their metabolism, their biology is both light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions that together make up what plants do in daytime and nighttime. So at night, they do absorb CO2. And in that way, plants do play a role in regulating greenhouse gases. That's why the issue of deforestation or preserving the Amazon is so critically important, because those, well, some people refer to the Amazon as the lungs of the world. In other words, that forest is emitting a lot of oxygen and it's absorbing a lot of CO2. So deforestation only makes much worse the problem of the greenhouse gases being there in the first place. And so this is, I love it that they have little bunny rabbits. Energy exchange in ecosystems. Plants use sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to produce sugars and other organic molecules. Consumers use oxygen and break down sugars during cellular respiration. Plants also carry out respiration, but during the day, if light, water, and CO2 are available, they have a net production of O2 and carbohydrates. Net production meaning that there's more O2 produced than the plant actually would need. So you can see in this photosynthesis reaction here, there's oxygen being given off here, and in here, the oxygen is being absorbed by the respiration of the bunny rabbit and the fungi that are actually consumers. So there's the earthworm, the fungi, and the herbivore. So this would allow for high quality energy for work, biosynthesis movement, membrane transport, and bioluminescence, which is a product of that's when things glow in the dark, like fireflies and all those little creatures in the sand on the beach that glow in the dark sometimes. And gives off heat, gives off water, and gives off CO2. And here in the photosynthesis cycle, absorption of CO2 and absorption of water. Why were we looking at any of this? It's important to understand that photosynthesis is the basis of all food chains, meaning that what we call primary production is different than consumption. So the only real producing part of a food chain is actually plants. Everything else is either herbivory, meaning you're eating the plants, or carnivory, you're eating the animals that ate the plants. So plants are the basis of the food chain. Therefore, it matters how much biomass, that would be if you weighed all the plants, how much biomass you have in the plant world to support the rest of the food chain. Another word for food chain is trophic ladder. So trophic meaning eating, again, so each step of the ladder is another consumer. The first order consumer is the herbivore. The second order consumer is the first order carnivore. In other words, who's going to eat the little bunny rabbit? So here you can see relationships. Each time an organism feeds, it becomes a link in the food chain, in an ecosystem. Food chains become interconnected when predators feed on more than one kind of prey, thus forming a food web. The arrows in this diagram indicate the directions in which matter and energy are transferred through feeding relationships. So food webs almost stand out because it even looks like a web with all the arrows going in different directions. So that this is trying to give you a sense of what the how should I call it? The landscape you're looking at, the biome you're looking at is a savanna. In other words, it's a tropical grassland, probably in East Africa. I'm guessing by the animal communities that we're looking at, possibly, Serengeti Park or something in Kenya or Tanzania, a tropical grassland. Tropical grasslands are typically called savannas. So this really beautiful about this food web, it's got every aspect in it, every trophic level in it. So beginning with primary production, another word for primary production is autotroph. In other words, plants don't eat other plants. So autotroph meaning they produce their own food. They don't need to eat another organism. So here's the stargrass, the oatgrass, and the acacia trees, which provide shade and even food for giraffes. So then you go to the next level up, you have your primary consumers, and these are your first order consumers. They're all herbivores. That even would include the bacteria in the soil. If there's in this case, it's showing you there's a dead mouse, looks like a larger than a mouse, that the bacteria are going to decompose and return to the soil as organic material that's going to help the grasses grow. So actually, savanna ecosystems, in terms of biomes, are actually much more complicated than observers originally thought, because the animals that feed on these grasses are critical to the health of the grasses. And then it's as a result of their feeding on the grasses. The animal I'm looking at is the wildebeest right over here. not exactly the most attractive critter, but their herds are enormous, millions of wildebeest in a herd. And they will migrate from Tanzania into Kenya and back to Tanzania in an annual cycle of migration, all along the way, eating the grass and leaving their waste products, which is essentially digested cellulose, digested grass. So their waste product, their dung, is vitally important to the survival of the grasslands. And that's why animals that feed in tropical savannas play a very important role in the health of the savanna all around. So the first order herbivores, you have grasshoppers, ants. Interestingly, the topee, which is related to the or close to a Thompson's gazelle, termites, warthogs, dung beetles, hares, and bacteria. And above those, you have a mouse, an impala, which is also an herbivore, a Thompson's gazelle, and the wildebeest. So these are all herbivores, large and small. And small, termites are small. Incidentally, there is a theory that has been really attacked, maybe unfairly, but it's a theory that was proposed back in the 1970s, that termites in particular play a key role in the regulation of the Earth's climate because of their numbers. There are so many termites, and they convert cellulose, plant material, into soil material, and in the process, they absorb oxygen, and they also provide their dead tissues for soil renovation. So there is interesting theories that come from basically crunching numbers and asking interesting questions. What role do termites and algae play, since their biomass is so significant in the Earth's biosphere? What role do they play in regulating climate? It's not well understood at all today, yet anyway. And the mongoose will eat the termites, will eat the mouse, will even eat dung beetles. So this is a carnivore, first order carnivore, second order consumer. Aardvarks, there is such a thing, awesome looking critter. They also, feed on small creatures like ants, for example, anteaters, that's what they do. Termites, they're eating insects, right? So the aardvark and the pangolin, a very endangered species today, or set of species, wonderful little critters. And of course, like everything humans do, we're obliterating the pangolin. We meaning that it's an interesting mammal because they have scales, right? They have scales that look like the bark of a tree or like the siding of a house. I mean, you should see a pangolin up close. And yet people in superstitious people say that, they heal themselves by eating the scales of a pangolin, just give me a break. And then the highest trophic level is the apex predator. These are the predators that don't get eaten by other predators. They're the top of the food chain. So you have eagles, vultures, servals, which is an interesting cat. I think that I don't know if this is true, that domestic cats are actually descendants from servals, but that would be somewhere in Egypt a long time ago. Caracals, cheetahs. So these are all felines, servals, caracals, cheetahs, and lions. And then you have hyenas and wild dogs as canines, but they are all, in fact, carnivores. They're all, in fact, apex predators. So they are the top of the food chain, or the top of the food web in this case. A food chain is a slightly different suggestion, because in this case, you would be looking at biomass, that is, what is available for each level of consumption. And then you would be also looking at the movement of energy through a system. So that's why food webs are used in order to assess the health of a system, like a forest or like a savanna. If you were an ecologist, you'd say, how is this savanna doing? Does it still have a full representation of all its biodiversity, or is it losing species? And the way you do that is you create food webs. This is a model. What we doing for time here? We're doing okay, yeah. Biogeochemical cycles and life processes. Now, there is a section, I don't know why publishers do this. The insert is on pages. See, they don't number the pages where there's inserts. Oh, get those close. 42 and 43. Is that right? Yes. On pages 42 and 43, you actually have a very important diagram, which I think they're going to save for the end of the chapter. So I've learned my lesson today. I think I need to go back through all of these slides and rearrange them because the publisher does this mistake. So on these 2 pages is something called key concepts. And the difference between a food web that we were looking at and a food chain is that the food chain is very specific with respect to what is available for the next rung of the ladder as you move up the trophic ladder. In other words, if you have 100, let's say let's ascribe a random value, 100 to plants. So there's 100 in terms of primary production. What is available for the herbivores? Well, it's called the rule of 10. What's available for the herbivores is 10% of the primary production of the plants. What's available for the first order carnivores? 10% of the biomass of the herbivores. What's available for the top carnivore or the apex predator? 1% of the primary carnivore's biomass. And that's why when you get to the top of the food chain, there are so few species represented as apex predators because they get 1% to 1% to 10% to 10%. And then there is an addition from detritivores and decomposers. So on these 2 pages, they actually visit the rule of 10 in many different ways, and they present it, and I think it'll be at the end of the chapter. So hopefully tomorrow I can fix this tendency that publishers have of treating tables and treating inserts as separate from the chapter structure. Here you can see what our the hydrologic cycle. Most exchange occurs with evaporation from the oceans and precipitation back to the oceans. 70% of the Earth's surface is oceans. So you're basically water is going from the ocean into the atmosphere, from the atmosphere back into the ocean. About 1/10 of the water evaporated from oceans falls over land and is recycled through terrestrial systems and eventually drains back to the oceans via rivers. So you can see the exchanges there being much greater in the oceanic system in terms of evaporation and precipitation. And they're measuring it in cubic kilometers. That's how much that water that is. The evaporation from the ocean is 425,000 cubic kilometers of water go from the oceans into the atmosphere. And then the precipitation over the oceans is 385,000 cubic kilometers. Over land, it's a lot less because all that moisture would have to move over the land from the ocean and basically precipitate down on the lithosphere. Over land, it's 110,000 cubic kilometers. And then you'd have to, what is going into the atmosphere? Well, there's evaporation from soil, streams, rivers, and lakes. That's 30,000 cubic kilometers. Transpiration from vegetation, very important little detail, is that forests actually produce a lot of water vapor. And that's why sometimes when you see an image, it can be a tropical forest, it can be a temperate forest, but you'll see that it's steamy. There's like these little puffy white vapor thingies. An example I can think of is along Appalachia, there is an area they call the Smoky Mountains. And it's not because there's smoke there, it's because there's so much evapotranspiration that it has these little clouds. So they call them the Smoky Mountains. But you look at the Amazon, same thing. You can see the trees actually give up a lot of water vapor. We saw that in yesterday's video, how critical that is for the entire biosphere. So the movement of moist air from the ocean to the land is 40,000 cubic kilometers. There's also the percolation through porous rock, what we call groundwater or aquifers. And that also does eventually make its way to the ocean. But that is what we depend on a whole lot. When you drill a well and you want water, that's what you're tapping. You're tapping groundwater. So you can either catch the water when it falls from the sky, the way they do in Hawaii. Hawaiian islands are so volcanic that they're really porous. So you're hard pressed to find an aquifer. I know you're thinking, what? They're tropical islands. It rains all the time, or some of the islands, it rains a lot. But the water just percolates right through. It's really hard to find an aquifer, to find a water table that you can pump water up. So in Hawaii, I've also seen they do this in New Zealand. People capture rainwater on their rooftops. So when you drive on the Big Island and you're on the wet side of the Big Island in Hawaii, everybody's got a metal roof. You're thinking, God, with this heat, who would want a metal roof? And then they have a cistern on the side of the house. And when it rains, which is a lot, that metal roof captures the rain and fills the cistern. And there is your water supply. And you might have to filter it if you're going to use it as drinking water, but not because rainwater is particularly polluted in Hawaii. So I'm pretty sure that it's considered potable right out of the cistern. You see that in Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii. You see that people do a lot of rainwater capture. In Los Angeles, we don't get enough rain for people to, in a sense, redesign their houses, but it has been done very successfully in LA because we get all of our rain pretty much during certain time of the year, like now. And that rain gets, if we had two things, what's called rooftop capture and stormwater capture. So rooftop capture is the rain is falling from the sky and landed on your roof, and you collected it and put it in a cistern or a barrel, sometimes called a rain barrel, on the side of your house. And that water you use to water your plants, wash your car, flush the toilet. So what's called gray water use, which is water that doesn't meet the potability standards for drinking water, but is nonetheless useful water, we could actually address a lot of our water needs by using that non-potable water that falls from the sky, that does not require that we drill wells into aquifers. So the other one is stormwater capture. That is a big deal in LA because when it rains, particularly if we get a real big rain, all that rain just goes out to the Pacific Ocean. I mean, just take a look at the LA River. It's a concrete straitjacket. The water has nowhere to go except the ocean. And so we've culvertized, to use a word. We've put culverts, which is storm drains, all over the San Fernando Valley, all over Los Angeles. All you do is, fly into LAX from any point back east, and you look over the San Gabriel Valley, and it's one concrete channel after another after another. We don't take advantage of rain. We just let it go. And it's crazy because there's actually a lot of water that we get in those few months of our rainy season. We do not live in a desert. We live in a Mediterranean climate. And what that means is that we get all of our rain one time of the year. We don't get steady precipitation the way people do in, Washington, New York, Boston. We get it all at once. So it does behoove us to invent ways to capture some of the stormwater and to capture some of the rooftop rainwater. This is another biogeochemical cycle. In this case, we're looking at the carbon cycle. Numbers indicate approximate exchanges of carbon gigatons, GT, per year. Natural exchanges are balanced, but human sources produce a net increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Low estimates are provided for deposits of fossil fuels, numerical data, and this is from the Global Carbon Budget 2019. And in fact, it is Copernicus.org is the website where they got this data from. So the carbon cycle is critical because it includes the fossil fuels. They are, in fact, hydrocarbons, right? So we do interrupt the carbon cycle, perhaps more than any other biogeochemical cycle, through the burning of fossil fuels. In other words, it's gotten to the point where we've changed the composition of the atmosphere in terms of how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. Without human industrialization today, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would average about 292 parts per million. Because of the Industrial Revolution, the harnessing of coal as a fuel source, and the discovery of oil and natural gas, we've added so much CO2 to the atmosphere that we exceeded 350 parts per million way back in the maybe 1980s. And that's the magic number that Bill McKibben, when he wears his t-shirt, 350.org, you wonder, what is 350.org? It's an international organization. It's primarily a youth movement, and it is, I swear, it's in 120 countries. It's everywhere. And what the 350 is parts per million of carbon dioxide. So they picked a name for their website and for their organization that is the same in all languages in the world. Everybody knows numbers, 350, and everybody knows the internet.org. So I invite you to visit 350.org and see what people are doing, particularly younger people are doing in different countries in the world to address the climate crisis. So this is how we've interrupted the carbon cycle. And we've also found deposits of coal, oil, and natural gas, which interestingly are very similar um, uh, hydrocarbons. Coal being solid, oil being liquid, and natural gas being a gas. They're not molecularly identical, but it is interesting that we have fossil fuels in 3 states of matter. So there is this cycling between photosynthesis and respiration, and it shows you here 100 gigatons of CO2 move in that particular process. But land clearing, burning fossil fuels, all of these then change the atmosphere so that today the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has exceeded 420 parts per million. That's too high, because what it means is that if we want to keep the average temperatures on Earth from rising any more than they are already, and we're already facing the possibility that we're going to blow right past 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was the original goal that climate scientists set up as what we should move toward, what we should not exceed, is 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the failure of international agreements and the success of the fossil fuel industry in sort of finding every way to extend its life has made compliance, has made what are unenforceable goals. You know, we have these international meetings, the committee, what is it called, the COPs, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, and they create these meetings, and everybody goes, and they make nice speeches, and they pat each other on the back with how much change they're going to make, and nothing happens. That's why Greta Thunberg has lost her patience with the COP28 was the epitome. That was really bad. That was the one in the United Arab Emirates this last fall, and it was almost a joke. It was so cynical. So we have to find other ways of getting what are mutually agreed upon goals in terms of reducing fossil fuel combustion. We have to find other ways of achieving that. And there are many ways. We can't wait for the Minister of Petroleum of the United Arab Emirates to decide that oil is a problem. Apparently, he doesn't think it is. So there is your carbon cycle. This is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen cycle is quite unique as a biogeochemical cycle because nitrogen is found in different molecular structures depending where it is in its cycle. So in the atmosphere, nitrogen is N2. Plants can't use N2 as a gas. They love nitrogen. It's most of the gases in our atmosphere, of all the atmospheric gases, nitrogen is the big one. It's over 70% of all the gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen. But plants can't use it that way. It has to go through a process called fixation. So nitrogen fixation, which actually happens in soil, where bacteria will produce ammonia or ammonium, ADTG. I think they're going to give me some weird little number there. I'll ignore the ADTG. Where is it? Where am I? Yes. Okay. The nitrogen cycle, human sources for nitrogen fixation, which is conversion of molecular nitrogen to ammonia or ammonium, are now about 50% greater than natural sources. Bacteria convert ammonia to nitrates, which plants use to create organic nitrogen. Eventually, nitrogen is stored in sediments or converted back to molecular nitrogen, where, and that's what the little numbers are, 1 teragram equals 10 to the 12th grams, or about 0.001 gigatons. So that is nitrification. The process of nitrogen fixation is critical for plants to be able to absorb nitrogen, and it's done by bacteria in the soil. But humans also extract or create nitrogen fertilizers by fixing nitrogen. So we've added to the amount of fixed nitrogen in this biogeochemical cycle to the point where it actually has had an effect on the overall biosphere. Plants absorb NH3, so this is the process of assimilation, NH4 or NO3 to make organic compounds. So in a sense, you have to harness that nitrogen either through oxidization or compounds with hydrogen in order to make them assimilatable to plants. Then the plants can have a great time with the nitrogen. There's a lot that also contributes to fixation just in terms of what decomposers and excretion do in rewarding bacteria that then convert ammonia, and that's that process known as fixation. Denitrification is where nitrifying bacteria oxidize ammonia to nitrate ions. So here you can see it's NO3 minus, and that then allows nitrogen to go back into the atmosphere denitrified as N2. So that's why it's a cycle. Starts out as N2, ends up as N2. But in the process of fixation and denitrification, it goes through these different parts of the terrestrial system, aquatic and terrestrial. They don't put in here, oh, yes, they did. Lightning and volcanoes actually fix nitrogen in the atmosphere to the tune of 10 teragrams, which is it's not hugely significant. It's just really interesting that the amount of energy traveling through the atmosphere in terms of electrical energy is strong enough to convert N2 into a fixated form of nitrogen. So the other thing that happens is what we talked about as a problem is that here you have your fossil fuel burning and commercial nitrogen fixation. Yes, 140 teragrams. So this produces a whole lot more than lightning and volcanoes. And it's going into a lake, causing a process known as eutrophication. So eutrophication is a process whereby a lake slowly dies, meaning that all the oxygen in the water has been used up, and then you have essentially a dead lake, and that eventually ends up and maybe might even end up in the lake not being a lake anymore. Plants and soil will take over, and it'll become a little declivity rather than what it was. This is nitrogen molecules are converted to usable forms in the bumps, the nodules, on the roots of the bean plant. Each nodule is a mass of root tissue containing bacteria that convert nitrogen in the soil to a form that the bean plant can assimilate and use to manufacture amino acids. So there's the process where a plant can take up nitrogen through the fixation that's carried out by bacteria, and in the bean plant, that's in these little nodules in its root structures. We're only beginning to understand how complicated plant roots really, particularly trees. We'll touch on that later, but it's fascinating that trees talk to each other. It used to be considered silly. Like, oh, really? Yeah. They do it through these very complicated fungal webs called myceliae, and trees can actually talk to each other. It's also the way that one particular scientist discovered what she called a mother tree, which is usually the oldest tree in a stand of trees that in a sense contains all the information that the rest of the trees in that particular grove or collection of trees might need. So it's now that she has, and she's been challenged on this. We'll talk about it when we get to forests. She's been challenged that it isn't true. But I think that it is any compelling theory in science deserves the time of day, meaning don't dismiss it out of hand. Check it out, because Darwin didn't know the mechanism of inheritance. For 100 years, we didn't know about DNA. So this discovery that mycelial webs allow tree roots to communicate to other trees, and that there is an original tree that has, in a sense, all the memory of the grove of trees, might seem silly today and might be a fact, tomorrow. It's sometimes how fast science moves. So here you can see what is the phosphorus cycle. Remember that phosphorus is one of our NPK fertilizers. So here too, you're going to see the role of adding phosphorus to a system. But phosphorus is unique. The natural movement of phosphorus is slight, involving recycling within ecosystems and some erosion and sedimentation of phosphorus-bearing rocks. The use of phosphate, which is actually not phosphorus. So phosphate is an oxidized form of phosphorus. It's PO4 to the -3. Fertilizers and cleaning agents increase phosphorus in aquatic systems, causing eutrophication. Units are in teragrams, that's TG, and phosphorus per year is 1 teragram equals 10 to the 12 grams. So here, once again, we have the problem of eutrophication. Phosphorus, we literally use it as fertilizer and as detergents. And it is, in fact, a very geologic. In other words, unlike what we saw with nitrogen, where most of it is in the air as N2, phosphorus is mostly um, I don't want to say sequestered in rock, but it's bound in rock formations and geologic formations. So there is this sort of steady leaking of phosphorus just from rains, just from weathering, snow, rain, ice on the mountains. They'll actually carry phosphate rocks, decompose them, and send them all the way down into the aquifer and all the way into the ocean. So the phosphorus cycle in terms of biogeochemical cycles is kind of unique in that you don't think of it in terms of any kind of atmospheric um, uh, residence time. It does not reside in the atmosphere. Nitrogen was the opposite. Most of it does reside in the atmosphere, and it has to go through that chemical process called fixation in order to be useful for plants. So that's why biogeochemical cycles, these particular ones we've been looking at, are so important because they are in the cornerstone of a lot of, well, not cornerstone, they are the cause. They are, in understanding them will help us understand how human beings have disrupted these processes through industrialization of society. The sulfur cycle is present mainly in rocks, soil, and water. It cycles through ecosystems when it's taken up by organisms. Combustion of fossil fuels causes increased levels of atmospheric sulfur compounds, which create problems related to acid precipitation. Remember that, you probably do remember that in high school, the one acid, we all remembered was sulfuric acid. And the formula for it was something we all remember from, junior high school, H2SO4. So H2SO4 is sulfuric acid. So if you're putting pollutants into the atmosphere that contain sulfur, that are oxides of sulfur, when they meet water vapor, which is H2O, there is a chemical reaction between the atmospheric sulfur, which is SO2 or sulfur dioxide, and water. And it creates an acidic form of rain that is far more acidic than the natural acid in rain. So rainwater in nature is slightly acidic, but acid rain is hella acidic. So it will erode and corrode. It'll erode rock. It's an amazing thing to see, but it's if you visit, Europe, and you visit one of these ancient Gothic cathedrals, particularly one that hasn't been restored. And, if you know Gothic cathedrals, they're very ornate. And they have these entrances that have niches, full of kings and queens and knights and saints and, little statues. And they're known as niches, those declivities in a wall where there's something in there. By the way, the word gets used in ecology to understand the functional habitat of an organism is its niche or niche. But the term is borrowed from architecture, and Gothic cathedrals or, churches in general really keen on niches where they would put, Virgin Mary or, King of England. And the acid in the rain has been eating away at these little sculptures, so that sometimes you walk up to a really old Gothic cathedral and you can't recognize a face on it. You can see that it's a figure, but it's sort of melted. It looks like it's melted. It hasn't melted, it's eroded or corroded. The acid, it has actually affected the stone from which those original sculptures were made. So acid rain is affecting ponds, lakes, and rivers. However, and here's the good news, there's the only source for acid rain is the burning of coal in a power plant. Nothing else. Well, let me take that back. Cars do have oxides of sulfur that they emit, but with catalytic converters, with better formulations of gasoline, with better internal combustion engines, the amount of oxides of sulfur coming out of the tailpipe of a car today are almost nil. But back in the day, that was a problem. So today, most of the acid rain, most of the atmospheric sulfur comes from the burning of coal. So what if you stopped burning coal in the power plant? I don't know, we almost burned something, so you burn something else. Well, this has been a fantastic success. It started in the 1990s in the United States. We basically reversed the problem of acid rain. So this is why I say this is good news. It proves that when we set our minds to something and we're able to agree on it politically in Washington, a real tall order today, but in the 1990s, it was not a real tall order, where Republicans and Democrats agreed that Nobody liked acid rain. Um, and the problem was simple, one source. The solution was simple, one policy. And so they used a system called cap and trade to get rid of sulfur oxide emissions from the smokestacks of coal-fired power plants throughout the US. Most of that sulfur oxides travel from west to east in the lower 48, as Alaskans call us, the lower 48 states. So that the worst acid rain was in New England, on the eastern seaboard, the mid-Atlantic states, the southeastern states. They got a lot of acid rain. And we didn't, even though the source where we were burning the coal to put the sulfur into the atmosphere was in Utah and Montana, California. So that is one of the real problems with big environmental problems, is that the cause or the source of a particular pollutant might be really far away from where it has its worst impacts. And that's why it's difficult to get cooperation, why you need a federal government and not a state government to do something about acid rain and to stop this process of destroying lakes, rivers, streams back east. Fantastically successful. Acid rain today in the lower 48 states is almost nil. And we turned the clock around in 10 years. In the 1990s, by the time the aughts came around, we had solved the problem of acid rain. That's why cap and trade can work when it comes to something like that, a single source where, it's just burning of coal. Now, what remains in the chapter, and I promise I will not let the publisher do this to me again. There's the fishing boat I was talking about at the beginning, where it's a trawler. That's why the masts are out on the sides. And here it's showing me again the biogeochemical cycles. This is the kind of shrimpies that are blind that live in hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. And here is the rule of 10 that I was telling you about that's in the insert in pages 42 and 43, I think it is. And it shows you that process. Now here they're getting very exact with the rule of 10. They go from 100% to 16.1%. And that's because they're including the role of detritivores and decomposers, which most of these trophic ladders, as they're called, or food chains, do not include the role of detritivores and decomposers. That's why you see here that that 16 is bigger than 10. And here you have the same idea of a food system. The primary producers, remember, is the plants. So this one's moving from left to right, and then what's consumed and what's not consumed. That is important because available biomass is what's available to be consumed. And so fortunately, it's never 100%, meaning that enough does not get consumed to play other roles in a complicated ecosystem. So you can see, for example, for the herbivore, eating, what is consumed in terms of primary production contributes to body growth. As digested, it's also part of respiration, so it's giving off heat. And of course, undigested is the decomposers and the sediments. So that's the bunny rabbit, but also the cricket and the butterfly. And then you get to the carnivores. So once again, though, notice the rule of 10. Primary producers, the green arrow, pretty thick. Herbivores, doesn't look like 10%, but it should be. And carnivores should be 10% of that. This picture is nowhere in the chapter. I have no idea what it's doing here. And then, oh, wait a minute. Yes, it's in the insert. Okay. Oh, I see. The insert is showing you that fires convert cellulose back into carbon, which is why it's interesting. In this case, you're seeing something that looks more like a controlled burn, meaning that the undergrowth in the forest is what's on fire and not all of the trees. When we look at the real bad fires that we've seen in California, recently, record-breaking fires, one of the things we're learning is that the native peoples in Western states, particularly in forests, actually used to set, on purpose, they would set fire to the undergrowth of the forest. And only today is the firefighting profession appreciating how important it is to remove the fuel load from a forested area. So removing the fuel load means you are going to set fire to the undergrowth, which is the grasses and small plants that are under the trees. And if you can burn them without harming the trees, then when there is a fire, a big ass fire, it runs out of fuel. There isn't enough plant material on the forest floor to continue the fire. So what does continue fires in California is when we have Santa Ana winds and the fire moves horizontally, but not on the ground. It moves horizontally in the air. So you have one tree after another catching fire. So fighting fires today is a more complicated science because we understand better the dynamics of fires, but we've also understood that putting fires out early on is ultimately bad policy. And it's always been the policy of the Forest Service and the Park Service and so on. The minute there's a fire, to go and put it out. And that's why we have fuel loads. Firefighters refer to it as a fuel load, that in Southern California, depending where you are in LA, those fuel loads in the chaparral, the brush that you can see, all around San Fernando Valley, it could be 25 years old. That's a lot of fuel. And that's why our chaparral fires are also quite devastating, because there's so much stuff that hasn't burned in a very long time. So I learned that from a firefighter captain who was explaining to us in the San Gabriel Valley why certain plants that we had growing around the house were very dangerous to the house itself as a structure, but also to the spreading of fires. And the one that he pointed out is an invasive species called the castor bean. I just took a walk in Sepulveda Basin yesterday, and ran into, there they are, the castor beans. They stand out because they're really dark green and they have those very spiny little fruits on them. They burn like nobody's business. They're like gasoline. So firefighters hate the castor bean. It helps a lot in chaparral fires and making them a whole lot worse. That's what I mean by helps. Here's your rule of 10 more properly displayed. And let's see, have we seen all the little critters? Oh, look at that. Okay, this one is single gram of soil can contain hundreds and millions of bacteria, algae, fungi, and insects. A single gram of soil, not a kilogram. Soil is a living thing. It's unique to planet Earth. We are losing soil today because of our industrial agricultural systems. We're losing soil because of erosion and water, extreme weather washing away soil. We're losing soil because we use inorganic fertilizers instead of organic fertilizers. And so soil loss today is alarming because the average depth of topsoil, which is what agriculture needs, topsoil, on Earth is 4 inches. So we'll get to that when we talk about agriculture. There's the whale, bunny rabbit, and the cricket, and the butterfly. This is what I was reading from earlier that should have been inserted in the right sequence, and it shows you the functions of some common elements, fertilizers, organic compounds, metals, and toxic elements. Remember, the ones at the bottom are all heavy metals: lead, mercury, and arsenic. And that's the little corner of the Gulf of Mexico that they picked for the fishing boat, I suppose. Voila. Aww. It's funny that when rats are white, we think they're so cute. And when they're not white, we think they're vermin. Same rat. Anyway, maybe that's a mouse. I guess rats have more pronounced proboscis, noses. And there's the dead zone we saw at the very beginning. So voila. We are done right on time, Letty. That is amazing.